Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Doug Simon looks at corn and soybean prices. Dean Groskurth talks about the importance of the USDA's March surveys. Bryce Anderson gives a spring weather outlook, and Andrew Kniss describes the increasing challenge of controlling herbicide-resistant weeds. Doug Simon from Tredas in Lincoln, Nebraska is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. The United States produced more than 15.1 billion bushels of corn in 2016. It'll export about 15% of that, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, with a healthy chunk going to Japan and Mexico. For years, Japan was the largest buyer of U.S. corn, but Mexico narrowly gained the top spot in 2015. The market across the southern border is in focus now, as the North American Free Trade Agreement is in the spotlight. If the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico deteriorates, recent reports indicate Mexico would look to supply in South America. We talked with Doug Wednesday afternoon about production in Argentina and Brazil, recent market price movements, and Mexico's import market for U.S. corn.
Well, Mexico imports about 500 million bushels of corn, and Japan also imports about 500 million bushels. Those are our two largest importers, and they import almost half of the corn that we export. So this deal with Mexico is important because they import about a quarter of our corn.
The talk now is, well, if they don't go to the U.S., they'll go to South America and look at Brazil and Argentina. Can you explain the logistics of how that would happen?
Well, last year, Brazil lost about 18 million metric tons in their safrinha crop, and so they don't have the exportable supplies available early or even, probably this year between them and Argentina. So even though they could maybe long-term replace the U.S., gradually over time, it's not something you would expect right away just because they don't have the supplies that are available or that are surplus to do that.
Is there a big price difference when you talk about U.S. versus South America?
They're, right now, they maybe have a slight advantage on us, but when you look at the world numbers on, actually like wheat, we've kind of become less competitive here just more recently on hard red winter wheat, but everybody else is fairly competitive. But on the corn side, we're all pretty, fairly competitive right now.
Staying down in South America, what do we know about harvest results?
When you look at the pace down there, really they're maybe a little bit ahead of pace in Mato Grosso and soybeans, but everywhere is pretty much on pace on the harvesting side in both Brazil, Argentina. The only thing that's really kind of ahead of pace is the planting that's going on in Brazil with their safrinha crop, or that second crop of corn, which was a disaster last year.
When those crops are coming online now, will they start to eat into U.S. exports?
Well, they definitely are going to come into the marketplace. But when you look at like our corn exports at this point, we're 60% ahead where we were last year. We're about 20% ahead of last year on the soybean side. I think wheat were about 40% ahead of last year. So those exports that we have coming out of this country are very good. And because they have their commitments already made on a lot of their corn, they're not going to be, they'll supplant maybe a little bit of ours, but really their commitments are already made.
Coming back to the U.S., and we're taping on Wednesday afternoon. The USDA is meeting for their forum Thursday and Friday. The talk is going to be acres, obviously, or at least some of the talk. What are your expectations for planted acres this spring?
Well, I think it all goes back to wheat. We've had a big drop in wheat price, and you look at wheat acres, we're around maybe 32 million acres on the winter wheat, which are down about half from where we were in 1985, and you look at, we weren't this low in wheat acres since like 1908 when my grandfather was born. So it's been a long time that we've been this low, but so where are those 4 to 5 million acres of extra wheat going to go? Well, there's a lot of talk that they're going to go to soybeans. We may pick up another 4 million acres of soybeans. You look at Kansas was a big loser of wheat, and soybeans seem to work there. There'll be probably some loss up in the Dakotas and Montana on spring wheat, some of the other wheats, but maybe the stuff will go to other minor feed grains. But the big question is how much there's talk about losing corn acres just because of the fact that that soybean to corn ratio is attracted to the soybean side of it. So we lose, maybe go from 94 million acres down to 92, 91. I saw numbers earlier in the year when corn was back at 375 that we go down to 88. That's all going to be in flux. It's going to depend on what happens with weather here during March and April as we go. How dry is it? How fast we plant? If it's dry, we tend to plant a little bit quicker, plant more corn. But all in all, I would think corn acres are going to be somewhere down around 91 million acres. Beans up somewhere up in that 87 to 88 million acre range would be my guess.
Analyze for me the recent price movements we've seen in corn and soybeans.
Well, I said 375 Dees corn. We had that, back in the October-November period, and we rallied here to $4. We've had almost a 25-cent rally. If you look back at the harvest lows and the old crop corn, we were down. We've rallied almost 50 cents on that. So we've had pretty significant rallies. As that's happened in the old crop corn, our basis levels have widened because there was a lot of corn. When you look at the U.S. supplies, we've had a big increase in carryover. It's not as big as increase in the world numbers on both the corn and the beans. The same case in the soybeans. So even though we've had these nice rallies, our basis levels have fallen off. So looking forward on the old crop, there's a lot of corn I think that needs to be moved. We're kind of looking at hedging remaining bushels that we haven't sold from earlier and trying to lock in that carry that's in there to May and July. And we think that there'll be some basis opportunities as you move into that April-May period. People are going to be going to the fields and farmers, supplies start to dwindle. Should be some opportunities on both, I think, old crop corn and beans. But then if you look forward at new crop corn, we're sitting near $4. We were sitting just over $4 last week. When you look at that, that has become profitable. Earlier, people were just focusing on beans and saying that's why we're going to shift to more beans because of profitability there. So we've got some good, I think, opportunities on new crop corn to lock in what I would consider to be profit margins, especially when you look at that at $4 and you look at March and May and July carry into next year, which puts you at 410 to 420 to 430, and then look at maybe better basis levels next year because maybe not quite a big crop. So I think those are good numbers to work with.
Can you give me an idea of where the funds are at right now in corn and soybeans?
On the corn and the soybean side, both, they're long. The managed money funds on the corn side are long about 85,000 contracts. On the bean side, they're long about 170,000 contracts. Last year at this time, the funds were short both the corn and the beans. And so there's been a lot of buying that's pushed this market higher on the corn side and on the bean side. So when they get to be that long, it gives you more, I think, market risk to the downside, or the things run out of steam to the upside. It gives you definitely cause for concern there.
Next week, Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. Crop producers across the country may be receiving USDA surveys this month regarding their intentions for the 2017 growing season. The agency is collecting data for its March 31st reports on quarterly grain stocks and prospective plantings, but it said earlier this year responses to those surveys were declining. Writing for the Farm Doc Daily publication at the University of Illinois, the USDA's chief economist and other authors said response rates for the March survey had fallen from more than 85% 25 years ago to less than 65% in 2016. They said less data would make estimates randomly more inaccurate, especially at the county level. Dean Groskurth is the director of the Northern Plains Regional Field Office with the National Agricultural Statistics Service.
We just mailed out our March agricultural survey. This will be the first reported data directly from farmers on their planting intentions for this upcoming year. Nationally, we will be contacting 84,000 producers throughout the United States. In Nebraska specifically, we will be contacting 3,400 operations. It's very important for farmers to respond. The more responses we get, the more accurate the data will be when we publish the data at the end of March. So it's very important to get a true picture from everybody, all size groups of agriculture, to make this report as valuable as possible. The whole infrastructure of agriculture relies on this data, whether it's an elevator, whether it's a barge company, is it exporting, what the seed dealers need to be doing, storage facilities. The whole infrastructure is counting on this first reported data from farmers and ranchers throughout Nebraska.
The USDA's reports on prospective plantings and grain stocks are scheduled for release on Friday, March 31st at 11 a.m. Central. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration says last month was the third warmest January on record across the globe, with average temperatures more than 1.5 degrees warmer than Earth's 20th century average. Nebraska experienced its 13th wettest January on record with data back to 1895. The latest U.S. drought monitor from UNL indicates no change in Nebraska, but it does continue to show relief for California and Oklahoma, two of the states with more severe dryness conditions. We talked Tuesday with DTN senior ag meteorologist Bryce Anderson to get an outlook of what might be in store for spring and an update on the situation across the Corn Belt.
Well, Jeff, things really are looking quite favorable. If anything, when you look at the northern part of the region, and I'm using U.S. Highway 20 between Sioux City and then toward Dubuque, Iowa, and then on north, there is a little bit too much soil moisture, very full profiles, but there's hardly anywhere in the belt where there's a big shortage of moisture. Eastern Missouri and into parts of western Illinois have some slight dryness, but there's still plenty of time for that to be taken care of, so there are no real dry areas right now.
What does that winter wheat area look like?
You know, things are looking better. I mean, over the last week or so, there's been some good rains in Oklahoma and into Texas. We know that back in January there was some record-breaking rain in the southwestern plains, and there's been some dryness develop since because it's been so warm. But again, there still is time for that part of the country to get some moisture and to bring things around. So I think things really look quite promising for the winter wheat areas.
Let's look outward into spring planting season across the Corn Belt. Do you have any concerns at the moment?
You know, the one thing that I'm a little bit cautious on is just how that northern belt is going to get along when it comes to field work, because there's definitely a full soil moisture profile in the northern Corn Belt. And I think that could be where we see some delays. But as far as elsewhere, I think we're going to get along pretty well. We've got obviously a pattern that has brought plenty of pre-season warming, and it's actually allowed producers to take care of some chores for spring field work and maybe, you know, kind of ease the pressure, ease the crunch a little bit, so that's been good. And then as far as temperatures and precipitation go during the spring, I think we're going to be in pretty decent shape to be able to have enough moisture to bring crops along in a good fashion, and also temperatures staying mild enough that I don't think we're going to have to worry about the ground getting warm enough to support germination when it's time to plant.
A year ago at this time, we talked about the possible transition from El Nino to La Nina. Can you update for me how that has gone and what you maybe see happening once we get into the summer growing months?
Well, the Pacific did turn to a cooler temperature pattern in the equator region, to a weak La Nina during the late summer and then through much of the fall season. But since about, I want to say about mid-November, that whole Pacific profile has gotten warmer to the point where right now there's just a small area of the central equator where the water temperatures are cooler. Every place else is turning warmer, and the official designation is neutral in the Pacific, but there's a very good chance that we could even be in a weak El Nino right now, and that's going to continue on through the growing season. And that is generally a favorable Pacific event when you think about its impact on yields.
Generally a good crop growing condition, yeah?
Yes, it is. Temperatures are generally pretty mild during the summer in an El Nino year, and there's also a round or two of precipitation when we need it the most.
Any concerns in South America where that second crop corn will go in?
Right now, there are none. South America, especially Brazil, has had a complete reversal from last year. The soil moisture situation started out the year in good shape, and they've continued to get rains to the point that the profiles pretty well are filled. Also, the soybean season has gone along very well in Brazil. They're moving harvest along, I think, briskly, and now they're starting to plant that second corn crop, to the point that they're probably going to have a very good growing season timing for that corn crop, with the result being yields and production that are going to be about at least 25% better than they were a year ago, and maybe even a little bit more than that. So the crop outlook in South America is really looking quite good.
What are the implications of precipitation we've seen further west and what that means for possible irrigation supply later on in the season?
Well, I think that with the kind of snow that has piled up out in the far west, I think for agriculture it's very promising this year for the growers in California and then into the desert Southwest for their irrigation allocations. And this is the first time in probably about 5 years that we've seen this sort of potential for the allocations to be basically at where they historically have been. And then even farther east into the North Platte Basin and the South Platte Basin, there's been enough snowfall that the reservoirs in Wyoming along the North Platte are getting to 70 to 80% at capacity. And so I think that we are looking at a pretty good, a very good prospect for irrigation water allocations out of the canals for this year when we get into the irrigation season here in Nebraska.
Later in the show, Al Dutcher will provide his weekly weather forecast for Nebraska. While temperatures fell off towards the end of this week, historically warm weather has sat across much of the Midwest this month. The National Weather Service in Omaha said the city set a new record for consecutive days above 50 degrees for February. Nebraska Extension's Bryce Anderson said on his weekly Hay and Forage Minute those temps have worried him with the current crop of alfalfa. Bryce says although alfalfa is a dependable crop, this winter has made predicting plant survival difficult.
The recent long spell of daytime temperatures in the 50s, 60s, and even some 70s probably awakened at least some alfalfa plants from winter dormancy. When alfalfa plants break winter dormancy, they use nutrients stored in their roots and crown and start to grow as if spring has arrived. A return to average winter temperatures forces these plants back into dormancy. Another streak of warm weather could break dormancy again, using more nutrient reserves. If this is followed by more cold weather, eventually the alfalfa plants will exhaust their reserves and be unable to start spring growth when spring truly does return.
Bryce says another concern has been snowfall, followed by repeated melting and freezing. He says ice on the surface can restrict gas movement and essentially suffocate plants. Bryce advises producers to check fields extra closely this spring and be ready to make necessary adjustments. The February Nebraska farmer says Rowdy Yeats didn't grow up in Nebraska or come from an ag background. However, this month's magazine says he and his wife Christy are working on something that could have a wide impact on Nebraska farmers and ranchers. At their homestead south of Chadron, the pair is making a product called High Plains Biochar. With their mobile unit, they process woody products and wood waste into a form of black carbon. Rowdy recently partnered with the Nebraska Forest Service and the University of Nebraska to study the possible health benefits of feeding small amounts of biochar to livestock. You can read about its potential as a feed additive in the February Nebraska Farmer. Herbicide-resistant weeds aren't unique to a specific crop, a specific state, or a specific country. Growers throughout the world are dealing with weeds that have become more difficult to control. 3 weed species have developed resistance to multiple herbicides in Nebraska, further increasing the challenge for the state's growers. At Nebraska Extension's recent crop management conference in Kearney, we spoke with Andrew Kniss from the University of Wyoming about how researchers and producers solve the issue of resistance. We started by asking about how those problems initially began.
Well, a lot of it relates to just the way we've been farming. I mean, we've substituted a lot of other weed control tools by the use of herbicides. So, where we used to be reliant on tillage for seed preparation and other things, we've moved to a lot of reduced tillage systems, no-till systems. And when you move to a no-till system, you have to control weeds somehow, and that's been historically done with herbicides. So that's at least part of the issue. But we've also just been using herbicides for long enough now, continually relying on the same herbicide modes of action, that it was inevitable that we're gonna see resistance develop when we use the same herbicides over and over again.
Out of all of the talks that I hear, the ones that are the most terrifying, I think, are the ones on herbicide resistance. Why do you think that is?
That's a really good question. I agree with you, and I have no idea. Part of it is I think there's a lot of us in Extension, me included from time to time, who have kind of tried to use fear as a motivator. So that might be part of it. But I also think part of it is that growers are actually probably more scared of herbicide-resistant weeds than they are of a lot of production problems, just because weeds are a continual source of revenue loss every year. It's not like a lot of the insect pest or disease pathogens that that are really problematic one year and then not for the next 2 or 3. Weeds are present every single year and robbing yield all the time. And so resistance from weeds is more of a problem in a lot of cases.
How effective is herbicide rotation?
So herbicide rotation on its own is actually not a very effective practice for herbicide resistance management. So if you just are applying a single herbicide mode of action one year and then a single herbicide mode of action the next year, even if you're rotating chemistries, it's not going to delay resistance very long.
So mixing?
So mixtures are great as long as both of the components of the mixture are effective for weed control. And actually, if you combine mixtures and rotations, that's probably the best of both worlds, because rotations can be effective as long as you're using multiple effective practices in each year of that rotation.
You had mentioned at the beginning those no-till systems, and I've heard before from weed control guys that are saying maybe that's not the best way to go, but there is an obvious benefit to those producers who are doing that. How do you play the in-between game here?
It's a really difficult thing because, I as a weed scientist, a lot of my weed scientist colleagues, we're focused on the weed management part of a production system. But if you look at what a farmer has to deal with, they're looking at soil health, they're looking at fertility management, they're looking at weed management and pest management and variety selection. And so from a farmer's perspective, it gets really tricky because you're trying to balance the benefits of multiple practices. And so it is very difficult. And, I'm not a proponent of moving away from no-till systems, but I do think we really need to evaluate what the benefits are of say, periodic tillage, maybe one out of every few years to get the weed management benefit, but try to retain a lot of the other benefits that those systems bring.
Maybe that goes into what you mentioned today. You thought maybe the solution to herbicide resistance isn't going to come from management of herbicides.
Absolutely. I think, if we want to do a good job on herbicide resistant management, we need to manage herbicides well. But if we continue to think that herbicides are going to solve the problem of herbicide resistance, we're going to be fighting this battle for a long time. We really need to start thinking about other management practices that are effective for weed control that are not herbicides, and including that in our discussion of multiple modes of action, because tillage is a mode of action when it comes to weed control. Crop rotation is another thing that we need to start considering more of.
Farmers and modes of action, do you think a lot of growers understand what modes of action are and how effectively to use them?
I think to some extent most do. I do think they're limited by their operation and costs on what they can reasonably put into practice. But I do think that in general, most of the growers I work with are aware of it, and they understand the herbicide mode of action group numbers, and so they definitely understand it. But even understanding it can be hard to implement from an economic perspective in a lot of cases.
I feel like I'm going to fear when I ask this question. In a year like this where margins are so tight, do you worry about farmers backing down or going to something a little cheaper in their weed management program?
Absolutely, and it's hard to blame them. I mean, if they're in a place where they have a low probability of having a investment pay off, it's hard to argue with those decisions. And that's one of the reasons why I think trying to get out of the always solving things with herbicides makes sense, because if we can figure out a way to get crop rotations where we have other herbicides and other practices that will help control weeds, I think in the long term that's going to be an easier way out, so we're not having to make so many year of production type decisions.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. Of course, the big news was a snowstorm that moved across the state on Thursday and then exited the state Friday night, which was last night. And then, of course, with the heavy accumulations of snowfall across the northern half of the state, lighter totals as you headed toward the Kansas border, but everybody shared in some of the snowfall, and unfortunately some of the heavier precipitation stayed in the northern half of the state, when we could have seen some of that in the southwest corner where we've been particularly dry. But overall, we've seen over an inch of accumulated moisture with this system, and in some areas pushing an inch and a half of accumulated moisture. So if you take it in concern in regards to how much moisture has occurred with this system in relation to our winter period, northwest and north central Nebraska, basically this storm accounted to the type of moisture you would see in the 2-month period from January through February. So a big event ground is thawed out now, so the slow melt of this system will get into the profile. Not much in the way of significant runoff. A very welcome event if you're, of course, if you're in cattle business. This may not have been the thing you wanted to see at this time of the year, but moisture is moisture, and we need to see every bit of it in order to get ourselves in a good shape as we go into the spring period. Now, as we go through this next 7-day period, it doesn't look like we're going to be dealing with any significant systems here in the Central Plains. Most of the activity will push to our east, and if we go to the upper air models, we'll see how this progresses through the week. So here's the trough that basically is bottom out to the south of us. The upper air low is now off northeast of the Great Lakes. That will push rapidly to the east, bringing all of this entire jet stream with it. We'll start to see a return flow as we get into Sunday, bringing our temperature up a little bit warmer. But then we will also notice another piece of energy moving in this flow toward the northeast that will basically lay out a foundation of precipitation across eastern Kansas, then really energize it, moves toward the east on Tuesday. And then we see the system really crank itself up on Wednesday. So we're seeing some pretty good weather maker in the eastern Corn Belt. And on our side, we start to see the cold air dipping in on Wednesday and Thursday from the north, bringing a chance of flurries, but nothing in more than basically 1/10 of an inch of moisture. And then we start to see the ridge trying to build in next weekend, and another system will start to move its way into the Pacific Northwest and will start to make its way into the northern Rockies as we get into late next weekend. That one has the potential to bring some very cold air once again into the western United States and set up the stage once again for a very active pattern, particularly across the northern plains, and that may actually be pulled farther southward into Nebraska depending on how cold that or how much that air penetrates down toward the south. In terms of precipitation, most of the precipitation with the big system that moved through this region is now exiting the Great Lakes region, and by Sunday will be over the northeastern United States. A little bit of moisture in Kansas that starts to erupt as that system gets organized over the mid-Mississippi River Valley, quickly exits out toward the northeast. We get a little bit of energy here in the southeast generating some returns, but most of it is just light precipitation once the winds come from the northwest and start pulling this moisture down into our region. And then yet again, as we go to Friday, you'll start to see some of that system starting to show up in just north of the Pacific Northwest. That looks to be our weather maker as we get late into next weekend. So if we look at the 8 to 14-day forecast, warm to our east, cold to our northwest, and from next Thursday to the following Tuesday, most of the precipitation rolls across the northern United States with a little bit of it in the southeastern United States.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews can be found individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, possible spring weather conditions, and herbicide-resistant weeds. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Next week, Jeff Peterson will analyze corn and soybean prices, and Eric Thompson from UNL's Bureau of Business Research will discuss the economic outlook for Nebraska in 2017. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.